In the background of Bosch's paradise landscape, we can make out many other animals. Some will have been familiar to contemporary viewers, such as the boar and its young, which appear to enter the painting from the right. Animals like the elephant and giraffe were not endemic to Europe, however. Bosch may have seen an elephant at a fair, where they would be put on display occasionally. On the Den Bosch market, seal meat and seal furs were commonly sold, and even live animals were offered for slaughter. In the late Middle Ages, a variety of so-called bestiaries were also published, showing pictures of existing animals as well as fabled animals such as the unicorn. By depicting all kinds of familiar as well as exotic animals, Bosch pays homage to the miraculous and diverse quality of God's creation. Amidst the pastoral landscape, we may be surprised to find scenes that represent the darker sides of nature. A lion devouring a young deer, and various animals locked in struggle. In the 15th and 16th centuries, people tried to answer the question whether animals were sinful by nature. On the fourth day, God said, "I give you every seed-bearing plant on the face of the whole earth, and every tree that has fruit with seed in it. They will be yours for food. And to every beast of the earth, and to every bird of the sky, and to everything that moves on the earth which has life, I have given every green plant for food." We are witnessing acts of violence and killing in paradise. Should we infer from this that the animal kingdom, as opposed to the kingdom of man, was never without sin? The giraffe shown in the left-hand panel may well have been copied from the journals written by Cyriacus d'Ancona. D'Ancona was an adventurous Italian who came from a wealthy family. In the late 15th century, he travelled the Mediterranean in search of archaeological finds from antiquity. Today, d'Ancona is considered to be the founding father of modern archaeology. In distant Egypt, he had laid eyes on a giraffe for the first time, of which he made a drawing to illustrate his travel journal. This giraffe is likely to have inspired Bosch. Mounted on top of a pile of gravel, a pink fountain sits proud. Its ornate details remind us of coral, but it also includes a wide variety of leaves, seeds, and branches. This fountain of paradise is the source of all life, the origin of flowing water from which plants, animals, and people drink. The fountain represents the perpetual creative power of nature, a symbol of life, fertility, and reproduction. In the centre of the fountain, Bosch paints a watchful owl, observing the scene depicted at the bottom of the panel. The owl is associated with danger and death, as a counterpoint to the source of life represented by the fountain. In earthly paradise there were many fruit-bearing trees. God had told Adam and Eve that they could eat the fruits from every tree except the tree of knowledge of good and evil. A biblical story tells us that the diabolic snake succeeded in persuading Eve to eat from the tree, Adam following suit. The punishment was the fall of man. God expelled Adam and Eve from earthly paradise. They became mortal and were given human imperfections, which made them capable of committing sins. Wrapped around a date tree is the snake, who is waiting to strike once Adam and Eve are married. Peaceful though this earthly paradise may seem at first glance, it already holds the dark promise of sinfulness in man. At the time when Bosch painted this owl over 5 centuries ago, it was often referred to as the Bosch bird. Its eyes wide open, the owl keeps a close watch on things going on around him. The owl is a nocturnal animal looking for prey. As opposed to the ancient Greeks, here the association is not with wisdom or intelligence, but with impending evil and doom. Just like the owl's prey animals always have to be on their guard, so must man remain alert to the devil lurking. The owl cautions us, careful, evil is watching you, waiting for an opportunity to strike. His marriage to the wealthy Aled van der Merwen gave Hieronymus Bosch access to a religious gentleman's society, the illustrious fraternity of the Virgin Mary, also known as Swan's Fraternity. Membership was restricted to men of noble birth or high social status. In addition to organising several dinner parties each year, where traditionally swan was served, the fraternity's main purpose was to practice the Catholic. It had members from the duchy as well as much farther afield, all filling the fraternity's coffers. By the year 1510, the fraternity had reached its high point, with 15,000 registered members, one of them being Hieronymus Bosch, whose membership put him in contact with many people, as well as earning him major painting commissions from other members. At the bottom of the rock, we see all manner of reptiles leave the water to crawl ashore. Perched on the rock is a striking-looking animal with lots of small paws, a carapace, and a long blue tail. In the water, among the frogs, our attention is drawn particularly to a strange three-headed creature, an invention by Bosch himself. To its right is another animal with an egg-shaped abdomen, already on land. These fantasy animals are once again proof of Bosch's amazing creativity as an artist. Today, when seeing these images, we tend to think of Darwin's theory of evolution, with vertebrate fish coming ashore to evolve into quadrupeds. Predating Darwin by 3 centuries, however, Bosch could not possibly have had any knowledge of evolution theory. Occultism, alchemy, and witchcraft. Hieronymus Bosch's name has been associated with all kinds of mystical movements. Here he paints a dragon tree, an oddly shaped tree. The crimson juice it produces is supposed to have healing effects and has been used for centuries for medicinal purposes, but also as a pigment. This exotic tree did not grow in the Brabant woods, and it's most unlikely that Bosch would ever have seen one, as it's only found in the Canary Islands, Madeira, and Cape Verde. The dragon tree symbolizes the tree of life, which gave Adam and Eve immortality in earthly paradise. It's no coincidence that Bosch should include the mysterious dragon tree, as it also appears in the illustration of the expulsion of Adam and Eve from the Garden of Eden in the Nuremberg Chronicle. Bosch actually copies all 3 trees in his earthly paradise. The context of this engraving by Martin Schöngoer may differ, but here it also takes pride of place, the dragon tree. Eve has just been created from one of Adam's ribs. In between them stands the Creator, looking us straight in the eye. He blesses the new couple and gives them the following injunction: be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and govern it. Below Eve's feet, rabbits are scurrying past, symbolizing fertility. In the days of Bosch, this quote from the Bible was interpreted as the institution of marriage. Medieval man saw marriage and reproduction as being inextricably linked. Sexual intercourse was intended only as a means to reproduce, not as an act of lust or desire. Hieronymus Bosch must have been around 30 when he married the well-to-do Eled van der Meerwen. He stayed with her until she died, but the couple were childless. The marriage, however, did provide him with access to an exclusive fraternity that was to play a significant role in his painting career. In the medieval world, the griffin or griffin symbolized dominion over land and skies. After all, the lion was seen as the king of the animal kingdom and the eagle as the most supreme of all birds. On the back of the griffin sits a man wielding a large branch as if it were a lance. Resembling some strangely attired knight in a joust, he takes on his opponent, a marine knight, similar to the one we saw in the water, borne aloft by a winged fish. His weapon of choice is a lance with an apple, cherry or berry speared on it. This bizarre joust between the two figures in the skies may well have been about honour, as was common in medieval tournaments. Then again, could also be part of a duel for the amusement of the figures in the Garden of Earthly Delights. However, none of them seem to be paying the slightest attention to this scene. Our eye is drawn to the peculiar constructions looming in the background. They are made up of all kinds of flesh-toned spires and pointed shapes, with many of these features penetrating other objects. The rivers are flowing past or through these constructions, which are inhabited as well as being climbed. They are covered with rocks, plants and flowers, as well as ostensibly man-made objects. The numerous jutting forms and thorns almost seem to suggest they were built to withstand a siege. Maybe Bosch alludes to a war raging in the panel depicting Inferno. Was God the architect of these constructions, or were they built by men? The buildings have gate-like openings at their base, through which people and animals are moving towards the fountain and the circuit. The large fountain in the middle reminds us of the fountain of paradise. The owl has been replaced by a man who is publicly fondling a woman. No longer lurking, evil, in the form of lust, has found its way to the very heart of the world. The cherries, brambles and strawberries are unrealistically large compared to the size of the people in the painting. In the Middle Ages, each of these fruits had specific connotations. The cherry symbolized fertility and eroticism, while the bramble was commonly associated with love. The strawberry represented temptation and mortality. A good Christian was not supposed to indulge in desire or lust. These figures seem somehow obsessed by the fruits. Are they merely celebrating life and fleeting pleasure, or is this scene telling us that lust and desire are bad things? In 1947, the German art historian Wilhelm Frege wrote that Hieronymus Bosch must have been a member of the occult society, the Brothers and Sisters of the Free Spirit. He found it hard to imagine that paintings such as the Garden of Earthly Delights were commissioned by religious patrons. However, his ideas might be attributed to a lack of insight into the many strange and fascinating details contained in Bosch's works. Frege's criticisms were readily dismissed by many of his contemporaries. Indeed, Bosch's work is firmly entrenched in a Christian pictorial tradition and is heavy with religious meaning. There is no evidence whatsoever to suggest that Bosch was involved in occultism. In fact, he was a member of the religious society called the Illustrious Fraternity of the Virgin Mary. Frege's interpretation of Bosch's paintings lacks historical basis and is not taken seriously by any art historian today. And yet, we can also see why Frege chose to interpret the painting this way. Shifting our attention to what's going on in the river in the background, the scene with the mermaid and the knight leaps to the eye. In these waters, maybe once the rivers of paradise, the two are making broad arm gestures, and it seems as though the knight is trying to embrace the mermaid. Both have a lower fish body. Giving in to primal passions and lust, these figures are not very different from the animals. Also, the man wearing armour may be an ironic touch, considering that his behaviour is anything but chivalrous. They are absorbed with each other to the point where they lose sight of the world around them, their unbridled lust driving them into each other's arms. In the centre panel, Bosch painted a multitude of nude male and female bodies. The erotic tension between the figures is almost palpable. The scene oozes temptation, desire and lust, and yet Bosch never makes it too explicit. Except for one scene. Inside the dark hole at the bottom of the central sphere of the fountain, a bearded man shamelessly touches the crotch of a naked young woman. In the days of Hieronymus Bosch, much building activity was going on in the city of Bosch. St. John's Cathedral could be seen from miles away. Outside the city walls, nature was still wild. The Duke of Brabant would go out into the woods to hunt game, which gave the city its name. Hertog means duke, Bosch equals woods. The mountain landscape and pink fountain featured in Bosch's Earthly Paradise will not readily put us in mind of a Brabant woodland. However, all Bosch had to do to find inspiration was cross the Dommel stream and wander out into the surrounding countryside. Driven by lust, men on all kinds of mounts are corralling a group of women. The men are seated on horses, camels, unicorns, boars and other animals. They are carrying fruits, eggs and birds, perhaps intended as gifts for the women who are bathing in the pool in the centre of the sea. Blinded by love and lust, the men appear to have lost control completely. Their mounts represent vice and deadly sins, such as lust, gluttony and pride. The women don't look particularly distressed. Is it maybe because their attraction gives them a hold on these men? The circuit refers to various medieval customs, such as fertility rituals, Morris dances with several men dancing around a single woman, and dancing around the May tree. At the same time, we see men indulge in unbridled lust, which will certainly lead them to hell, as is depicted in the right-hand panel. The owl is not the only bird that fulfills a key role in the triptych. Here we see a huge assembly of oversized birds with people riding them. We recognize bird species such as the green woodpecker, the hoopoe, the robin, and the duck. The birds could also be taken as a double entendre, as well as being an obsolete plural form. The Dutch word vogelen, vogel equals bird, could refer to having sexual intercourse. Right next to the owl, we see a man and a woman locked inside a glass sphere. The sphere is attached to a large flower, which in its turn sprouts from the pink ball floating on the water below the couple. The man has put one hand on the woman's belly, looking up at her with hungry eyes. The woman has put one hand on his thigh. Like many other details of the centre panel, this is a clear reference to sexuality and lust. It can be seen as a Boschian variation on the small vessels depicted in late medieval books with courting couples confessing their love for each other. The sphere separates the two from the other figures, but we also see small cracks appear. Again, danger is lurking, maybe even more so, because the figures inside are about to surrender to feelings of lust. In 1517, 1 year after Bosch's death, Cardinal Luigi d'Aragona visited the Brussels palace of Henry III of Nassau at Coudenberg. His secretary, Antonio de Beatis, kept a travel journal in which he described the moment when the cardinal and he first saw this triptych. A priceless document, because it tells us that the painting was actually in Brussels in that particular year. De Beatis writes about the lifelike animals and many bizarre scenes in the triptych, including a mussel shell with 3 legs sticking out. Inside are 2 persons who only have eyes for each other, never once looking at the pearls rolling out. The figure with a mussel shell on his back gives us a conspiratorial look. He knows full well what's going on inside. Although the majority of the figures in the centre panel are white, it does include a couple of dark-skinned people. In medieval Europe, black people were a rare sight, and the then prevailing views of Africans in particular were quite negative. The people of the Low Countries had little knowledge of countries outside Europe. Dark people were associated with debauchery, lack of civilization, and loose morals. Anything exotic was put on a par with sexuality. It is hard to tell why exactly Bosch chose to include these figures, as he may also have wished to represent the diverse quality of God's creation. Or maybe it's a bit of both. These figures are busy picking and eating apples. It's a direct reference to the fall of man, Eve picking the apple from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, thus acting against God's express prohibition. The figures depicted here only seem concerned with eating apples. They show little evidence of having any knowledge of good or evil, which is true of most figures included in the centre panel. They too get carried away by feelings of lust and desire, such as the figure on the left, who is presenting a strawberry to the sitting woman while leering at her. She has one hand on her stomach. Maybe she's pregnant, or has she eaten too much fruit? Painting this all-consuming blaze may well have conjured up childhood memories for Hieronymus Bosch. In the year 1463, a great fire raged in the city of Den Bosch, reducing 4,000 homes to ashes. It must have left an indelible impression on the minds of any citizens, including the then 13-year-old Hieronymus. In Bosch's depiction of hell, a devastating fire sets the city ablaze. People try to escape the fire using ladders or jumping into the dirty water of the city canal to certain death. Amongst the flames, we see crowds of people and armies moving about, while at the heart of the scene stands a windmill, its sails smouldering. The massive fires highlight groups of figures caught in the inferno. A group of lost souls is being squashed by a pair of huge ears with a knife wedged between them. An army is marching towards the oversized contraption. The ominous-looking ears resemble a war machine, but the similarity to a male sexual organ is also unmistakable. The ears have been pierced by an arrow, blood oozing from it. The knife bears a symbol that looks like a letter B or an M turned on its side. This particular symbol keeps returning in Bosch's works. It tells us that Bosch liked to include objects from his native city in his paintings. In the 15th and 16th centuries, Den Bosch had a thriving knife industry of international repute. Its knives were exported as far as Spain and Scandinavia. In the city, knives bearing the same symbol have been found in archaeological digs. Below, we see a knife that was used to peel potatoes in Bosch's times, but may also have been used to cut off ears from thieves. Corporal punishments were quite common, and chopping off ears was reserved for incorrigible kleptomaniacs. Amidst the smouldering apocalyptic landscape, a hostile army is seizing the city. The city gates are left wide open. Black silhouettes on horseback are galloping across a bridge, while underneath hundreds of wretches are drowning. The army, holding banners and spears aloft, is led by a horned demon. He is riding an animal that is not easily recognizable, but just like its rider, it was undoubtedly born in the darkest, deepest reaches of hell. Gatekeepers stood watch at Den Bosch's 3 city gates, blocking them at night to keep the citizens safe. The threat to the city was only too real. The duchies of Brabant and Gelre had been at loggerheads for centuries. Den Bosch always managed to keep the Gelre troops out, but knew all about the pillaging committed by the enemy. Surrounding villages were burned to the ground. From a stick, a giant key is dangling. A man, clearly drunk, is hanging limply through its eye. The key is the traditional attribute of St. Peter. Jesus spoke to him, "You are Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. And I will give unto thee the keys of the kingdom of heaven." For this reason, in the visual arts, St. Peter is invariably shown holding one or two keys, as in the left panel of Bosch's Adoration of the Magi in Madrid. Here, however, the key appears in hell and is used as an instrument of suffering. And if this is actually St. Peter's key, that would mean that the kingdom of the dead mentioned in the Bible did prevail over the church and the kingdom of Christ. Then again, it could also be the key to hell itself. Immediately above it, new souls are ushered into hell, the key perhaps serving as a reminder to all that the gates of hell have been opened. Here, a horse's skull doubles as a roof. A black crow is flying past, disguised as a gravedigger. Bosch cautions the medieval viewer, remember, one day you will die. It was a central theme to anyone living in the Middle Ages, memento mori, taking the form of the Black Death, the plague, devastating city fires, famine, deadly pandemics, or being burned at the stake. Death was everywhere. Medieval man believed that in the afterlife he would be called to account for his conduct in life. The nature of the sins committed determined how much time his soul would spend in purgatory. Life is short, but eternity would last forever for sinners burning in hell. This odd creation, the tree man, has a human face and is crouching forward, it seems. The shoulders are propped up by legs resembling tree trunks with branches sticking out. The tree man is balanced on two small boats in which a group of people try to find shelter. In the tavern, inside the tree man's torso, a woman is pulling pints from a barrel, and we see a crossbow hanging from a tree. A man is sitting on a giant toad, a symbol of the devil. The head of the tree man is surmounted by a large bagpipe, the instrument of sloth and idleness. The tiny flag on his eggshell back also shows a bagpipe. It may well have been sloth and alcohol that condemned the figures in the diabolical tavern to hell. We see helmeted people standing in and around a large lantern. One of them is being skewered by the sword of a demon. On a large round disc in front of it lies a knight, overpowered and being torn to pieces by monstrous predators. In his hand he holds a chalice, while next to it we see a wafer, a clear reference to Christian liturgy with bread and wine symbolizing the body and blood of Christ. These diabolical creatures have devised their own dark version. The mutilated knight is lying on a large pale red wafer that is being cut by a big knife. Below it, a demon is riding a naked woman, driving her into a large pitcher, which could be filled with wine. An infernal parody on a religious custom taken from Christian liturgy. In hell, the owl again makes its appearance, now acting like a demon from a nightmare. With a pot on its head and jugs for shoes, it is sitting on a giant potted chair. Human bodies are being consumed and excreted simultaneously, to go straight into the sewer. In medieval days, the river running through the heart of Den Bosch was an open sewer. Its stench pervaded the streets of the city. Only the very rich could afford a closet perched above the river where they could relieve themselves in private. Ordinary people would defecate straight into the river. The elegant potty chair painted by Bosch would only be found in the homes of the city's wealthiest. After his marriage with Adelaide, he would become one of them, and most likely a similar chair took pride of place in his home. On the edge of the sewer we see three figures. One rich stinker is pooping coins. The figure right next to him is throwing up. Bosch had made an earlier painting themed on the 7 sins. Could it be he's depicting gluttony and greed here? A figure is being crushed by a giant lute. On his buttocks we see a 4-line musical stave that appears to have been tattooed into the skin. Today, musical scores are written on a 5-line stave, so it's always been a complete mystery how the musical notes sounded. Several musical historians have attempted a transcription into modern musical notation. In these darkest corners of hell, all kinds of gambling games are depicted, including backgammon and card and dice games. The players, however, are diabolical assailants rather than human figures. Terrified and powerless, these people are being tortured with knives and swords. We get the impression they are the stakes in the games being played. At the top left on the table, we even see a tally being kept. Are these souls being punished for indulging in gambling and playing games? Bosch's Hell panel is a far cry from other medieval depictions of Inferno, where we often see people being boiled, burned, or eaten alive. The suffering going on in this panel is not just on the physical level, it's also psychological. The souls are being driven mad by fear, anxiety, chaos and distress. This scene also tells us something about which games were popular in the late Middle Ages. We know that backgammon was already being played around 1300 in German-speaking countries. The Garden of Earthly Delights is proof that 2 centuries on, the game had spread to the province of Brabant. This demon is torturing a sinner. With his left hand, he grabs the man by the throat, while using his right hand, he thrusts a sword into the sinner's chest. On the back of the monster, we see a shield with a knife skewering a hand. The hand is raised in blessing, echoing the gesture made by God's hand on the left panel. No one is being blessed here, that's for sure. On top of the man's hand, we see a dice, a reference to the gambling depicted elsewhere in the panel. Gambling was seen as a perfidious and evil pastime, which turns the shield with the hand into a devilish parody on the divine blessing discussed earlier. This torturing demon uses it as his own weapon. The place is truly God-forsaken. At the feet of the soul-devouring demon sits a naked woman. A demon grabs her from behind, while on her chest we see a toad, traditionally a henchman of the devil and symbol of impurity. On the left, we glimpse her reflection in the backside of a monster. She keeps her eyes closed, maybe because she's too embarrassed to face her own image. The hands of the demon behind her are exploring her body. Maybe it's undue indulgence in lust, a deadly sin, that caused her to end up in hell. An interesting detail There's a slight resemblance between the woman and Eve depicted in the left panel. Sheer coincidence, or is Bosch making a statement here? An ink jar is dangling from the mouth of a helmeted demon. A man wearing a pale red robe and a pig dressed up as a nun tried to persuade a soul to sign a document. This is a serious legal document. The red seals are testimony enough. But what exactly is this man signing for? Maybe they want the man to sign a pact with the devil to sell his soul. To make it look more convincing, the three have dressed up as a knight, nun, and clerk. The nude man is onto them, it seems, as he is casting anxious looks at the viewer, as if pleading for help. At the same time, he seems to be warning us, don't fall for the devil's tricks. In the late 13th century, work started on the building of a Gothic cathedral. The existing St. John's Church was extended to become a cathedral that would be the most imposing church of Den Bosch and far beyond. A lot of money was needed. The church raised most of the funds required by selling indulgences. An indulgence was a document you could buy to have your sins forgiven and secure a place in the hereafter. The fraternity of which Hieronymus Bosch was a sworn member played a key role in the indulgences industry. A year after Hieronymus Bosch's death, Martin Luther published his critical 95 Theses. This would signal the start of a process of reformation within the Catholic Church, ultimately leading to the birth of Protestantism. One of Luther's criticisms concerned the abuse of indulgences, which he felt flew in the face of the pure doctrines of the Church and a truly religious life. It looks innocent enough, a black mould on rye grass. Yet nobody knew at the time that this ergot fungus was the cause of the rot or gangrene that would turn limbs coal black. Bosch paints a sawed-off foot to remind us of the story of ergotism, sometimes referred to as St. Anthony's fire. If you ate bread from the wrong baker, sores would form on your body and eventually your leg would turn black and fall off. In vain, the surgeon might try to save your life by sawing off the affected limb. After ingesting the poisonous ergot, limbs would rot away, while the mind would be addled by hallucinations, ultimately leading to insanity. Did Hieronymus Bosch paint his garden of earthly delights while suffering from a bad trip? Although the destructive effects of the mad rye were known well before our era, it was not until the 16th century that the discovery was made that the black mould on ryegrass was the culprit. Before that time, people believed this condition was the work of the devil. And it was only in the 1950s that a component from the ergot was synthesized to produce the psychedelic drugs we know today as LSD.